Hello and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going deep. We're digging into our collective past to unpack a pretty powerful idea that the inequalities we see all around us today have ancient roots, written not just in history books, but in our very DNA.
I mean, have you ever wondered why so many of our societies are built on these ladders, these hierarchies? Where does classism actually come from? Well, it turns out the answer is this epic story of invasion, power, and genetics that kicks off thousands and thousands of years ago.
To really get a handle on the world that was created, we first have to understand the world that was lost. So let's take a trip back in time to a period we call Old Europe.
Okay, so picture this. More than 6,000 years ago, Europe was home to these societies descended from Anatolian farmers who had mixed with the continent's original hunter-gatherers. And from what the archaeology tells us, they painted a very, very different picture of the world. These cultures, it's proposed, were way more egalitarian, more peaceful, maybe even matriarchal, a world away from what was coming next.
This was a world that had thrived for millennia, but it wasn't destined to last. A new group arrived on the scene, and they brought with them a totally new world order.
So, the invaders who brought this new world order, they left behind more than just a new way to structure society. They left a crucial clue, one that was hidden right inside our DNA, a conqueror's signature.
And this was a true clash of worlds. You really can't overstate it. On one side, you had the pretty peaceful farmers of old Europe, and on the other, you had the Yamnaya, these warlike horsemen from the great Eurasian steppe. They were patriarchal, they were mobile, and they were obsessed with hierarchy, with elite warriors right at the top. You had two completely different cultures on a collision course.
It's an incredible story, right? But how can we be so sure it went down like that? I mean, how do we know it was a violent takeover and not just some gradual, friendly mixing of cultures? Well, the proof isn't just in old pottery. It's written in our genes.
So the genetic smoking gun here comes down to two specific kinds of DNA. First, you've got the Y-chromosome. It's only passed from father to son, so it traces the male line, in this case, the conquerors. Then you have mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. That's passed from a mother to all her children, so it traces the female line, in this case, the local population. Comparing these two, well, that's the key that unlocks the whole story.
And when scientists did exactly that for the Iberian Peninsula, so modern-day Spain and Portugal, the results were just staggering. Before the Yamnaya show up, both the male and female lines are 100% local. But after they arrive, the maternal, the mtDNA lines, they stay almost entirely local. But the paternal lines, the Y-DNA, whoa. About 90% of them were completely replaced by the newcomers. That is a stark, undeniable genetic footprint of conquest, invading men taking local women.
This model, a hierarchical society forced on people by a conquering elite, this wasn't a one-off thing. It became a blueprint, a pattern that was basically exported and tweaked all across the globe, creating some of the most rigid social structures in all of history.
For instance, a branch of the Yamnaya's descendants, the folks we call the Indo-Aryans, they expanded east into the Indian subcontinent. And what do they bring with them? You guessed it, that same blueprint for hierarchy. And with it, they set up one of the most rigid and long-lasting social systems ever known.
The Varna system they built, which they justified through religion, was just incredibly rigid. It was designed to be totally impermeable. You were born into your station, and that's where you died. And what's really telling is that the word itself, Varna, it means color. It was used to draw a line between the noble color of the invaders and the enemy color of the locals. I mean, talk about a blueprint for permanent social segregation.
Okay, now let's fast forward thousands of years and leap thousands of miles across the planet. When the Spanish, who are themselves the genetic and cultural heirs of that same Yamnaya tradition, show up in the Americas, they put in place a system that looks, well, it looks strikingly similar, all to control their new societies.
But even though there are these chilling similarities, the Spanish caste system had this, well, it had this perverse twist. Unlike the totally sealed-off Varna system, the Spanish system, which was based on purity of blood, actually allowed for a certain kind of social mobility. It was a brilliant and terrible tool for social control because it encouraged people to buy into the hierarchy with the promise that they could whiten their family line over generations.
This system was unbelievably detailed, with dozens and dozens of labels for all the different racial mixtures. And yeah, children could theoretically move up if one parent came from a higher status group, but, and this is a really crucial exception, there was an absolute uncrossable line. For the descendants of enslaved Africans, there was zero possibility of moving up. None. They were permanently locked at the very bottom of the pyramid.
Look, this isn't just ancient history. It's not something in a dusty old book. We can actually see the legacy of these events today, not just in how our societies are structured, but in that same genetic signature we first saw with the Yamnaya. It's an echo, right in our DNA.
That genetic signature, a conquest we saw in ancient Iberia, it wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a one-off event. In fact, we see this exact same pattern, invading male DNA, replacing the local lines, happening again and again and again on a global scale.
Take the modern-day Canary Islands. Centuries after the Spanish conquest, if you test the DNA today, the paternal line is mostly Spanish, but the maternal DNA tells a totally different story. On some islands, up to 60% of it comes from the original indigenous Guanche people. It is the exact same Yamnaya pattern playing out thousands of years later.
And this pattern is written all across the Americas. In Latin America, Y-chromosomes are overwhelmingly European, while the mitochondrial DNA is overwhelmingly from indigenous and African women. And here in the United States, the fact that many African Americans carry European Y-DNA, well, it's a silent, stark testament to the brutal power dynamics of slavery. It is the genetic echo of conquest and oppression.
It all comes back to this one central idea, that what we're seeing in our world today is, quote, the long, dark echo of a hierarchical social system that was imposed on horseback 5,000 years ago. In a very real way, the past isn't even past.
So what this all means is that the patterns of power and inequality in our world, they aren't random. They aren't accidental. They have a deep, tangible history. A history that has been physically written into the silent code of our DNA.
And that leaves us with a really vital question. We now understand this deep history, but if the legacy of inequality is written so deeply into our past, what does that mean for our future? Are we just destined to keep repeating the pattern, or can we finally break it?